Yeah. So welcome everybody. My name is Dipankar Vasu. Uh, this program is organized jointly by the Sanati Organization for Solidarity with People's Movements in India, the South Asia Forum in MIT, and the Alliance for Secular and Democratic South Asia. So we are really pleased to have Gautam Navlakha here with us. He's going to speak to us today about war and politics, his reflections on contemporary India. So Gautam has been a long time civil liberties and democratic right activist. He has been working with the non-funded organization based in Delhi called People's Union for Democratic Rights. He was associated with the Economic and Political Weekly in India for close to 3 decades. He has been writing a lot on Kashmir, on the Northeast, and a couple of years ago he visited Chhattisgarh, where the Maoist movement is very active. And he wrote a very detailed commentary on life there. He met their leaders, and his book was published in 2012 called Days and Nights in the Heartland of Rebellion. So with that, I'll hand it over to Gautam. So Gautam can speak for 45 to 1 hour, and then we'll open it up for comments, questions.
Thank you very much. Why don't we move closer, because we are so few, might as well. Yeah.
I forgot to tell you about this book. So Sanhati is mainly a web-based organization, but we do collect our articles and annually publish it as a book. So this is the collection for 2012 and 13. Contributions from $5 to $10 are welcome. Hopefully you can take a look at it.
Thank you to Sanati and South Asia Asian Forum, and for the secular Alliance for Secular Democracy in India. I want to speak about something. Let me begin by, we can't be oblivious of war and politics in today, when Gaza is before our own eyes, and before, while we watch, Gaza is under destruction. We have, while the Palestinians may not have Air Force, Army, to match the Israeli firepower, which is backed by the might of United States of America and bankrolled to a large extent by my own country, India, which is something very shameful, and I feel terribly dishonored as an Indian to know that at a time like when Gaza is being destroyed and civilian and especially children, death toll keeps on mounting, the government of India still takes a position which is rather ambivalent, and for good reasons. And I think that connection needs also to be brought into focus. So while we helplessly watch destruction of a people, it's time to start taking and understanding wars in different way in which we have so far understood it. We look at wars and we are either repulsed by it, by the idea of wars to resolve issues. It's something that we find repulsive, and especially in the wake of First and Second World War and the number of Indochina War and all. After all, there is a significant section of intelligentsia which abhors the idea of waging war under any circumstances also. So there is a reluctance to start looking at wars as they take place amidst us. Even when, wars haven't stopped. The number of wars that are going on in the world today, their numbers keep on increasing. The role of states in fomenting proxy wars, we know from Libya, Iraq, Syria, etc., have increased. Wars to overthrow regimes that are which follow interests or whose interest clashes with the interest of NATO countries suffer. We see it happening, and at the same time in India, since 1947, we have been witness to relentless wars that have been fought against our own people in different corners of the country, and we have been practically oblivious of these wars. We are neither concerned with issues of war and the rules that govern war, or the question of constitutional rights and what happens if there are armed conflicts that take place in a corner of the country, in different parts of the country, what happens to those constitutional freedoms, civil liberties, the question of justice, etc. Then we realize that actually for 67 years the Indian state has been fighting, and not just wars, that it has empowered its forces with legal immunity, which frees them from any attempt to bring them under, to face trial for any crime that they commit. So be it Northeast from Nagaland to Mizoram to Tripura to Manipur, Assam, Jammu and Kashmir in the last 25 years now, quarter of a century of relentless wars against the Kashmiri Muslims by the Indian state. And now the wars that are being fought in 9 states of central India against the Maoists in the name of fighting and eradicating terrorism. I mean, terrorism has become an all-encompassing word to attack Muslims in India. It is used to target now the Maoists in a relentless fashion, and now they are stepping up the war. So it's time that we start understanding what wars is and what happens, because two things that we have to keep in mind. While peace is something that we all aspire to, we would like to have peace and justice, where we're not forced to go into any conflictual situation or armed conflict to resolve issues. It's not something that is in our hands. It's not always control. I mean, if the Gazans today have to stand up and they say that they don't want ceasefire, they are not interested in ceasefire, the Gazans. They are saying that the kind of the rules that the occupation forces imposed against, where their entry and exits are controlled, their trade is stopped, all that must end, because mere ending of strikes on Gaza will not end matter. I mean, fine, peace will prevail, peace meaning the absence of violence, but the issues will not be addressed, and the real issues will still remain the same, and the Gazans would continue to suffer at the hands of the Israeli forces, which are far superior. So Gazans seem to be much more determined to fight on. Now, whether we like it or not, that's the only choice the world has left for them. There is no other choice left for them, because there is not a single power, there is no United Nations that can apply or enforce itself or intervene in this matter. It's period as far as the Gazans are concerned. So faced with a choice like that, we can't take a moralistic stand and say that the Gazans should fight constitutionally, peacefully, etc., and the people of the world will stand by them. They do not stand with them when they face massacre. So that we have to realize, and should force us into accepting that we have to start looking at wars a little more seriously, understand what is after all happening. What is war? Clausewitz explained that it's an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. It's it looks very simple. But it is. It encompasses an entire practice in it. Because it's an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. You are asked, who is an enemy? Now, which is the enemy that the government of India is fighting in different parts of the country? Who are these enemies? That is a question that would arise. That you want them to do your will. India's doctrine of counterinsurgency says very categorically that its main object is to transform the will and attitude of the people. Okay? Will and attitude of the people. It flows from. So the war is meant. When nation states fight war, or imperialist countries fight wars, they fight to impose their will on the Uh, in such wars, obviously the objective of the state is to force the insurgents to fight on the agenda or on terms of the regular forces, which are far superior, and when once you draw out the insurgents, you can kill them. But one of the one of the most important authorities on counterinsurgencies and small wars, C.E. Caldwell, wrote in 1966, and his small wars are still part of armed forces in different parts of the world. It's still part of the curriculum. Small wars is a very important document for all counterinsurgency. And drawing on his experience in Second Afghan War and Boer War, and meant for British officials posted in Afghanistan and India, this book he points out that the history of small wars has shown that insurgents use hit and runs, striking boldly and then retreating quickly, and rarely engaging larger forces head on. Therefore, according to him, mere victory is not enough. The enemy, and please mark my word, the enemy must be thoroughly and utterly destroyed to the last man, woman and child, which means enormous civilian casualties. The level of violence and barbarism, one would have believed that the democracies would be very sensitive to that heavy cost of incurring such civilian casualties. But we know from all the wars that we have seen, including Second World War, that the civilians were not spared. And as we see in Gaza, some people are even saying that it's not a war, it's worse than that. It's clear, and it's a situation of complete and utter barbarism that is being, it's kind of a Holocaust. It's being compared to what was done in Warsaw Ghetto during the Second War by the Nazis, where they used the argument of the insurgents amongst the Jewish partisans amongst the ghettoites as an argument for attacking the ghettos, if you remember. And this is the same argument that the Israelis today use in Gaza, the saying that these people reside among the civilians, that the hospitals, the UN offices, etc., are actually where the insurgents are taking shelter. This is how the states delegitimize, legitimize their violence and delegitimize the rebels. They are robbed of the history, they are robbed of the context. So the Palestinians and the Gazans appear as in the Israeli discourse, in the American discourse, they appear as the ones who are to be blamed for firing rockets which affect the Israeli civilians. Decontextualized from the entire history of Palestinian struggle, what is happening in Gaza, the way in which the Gazans have been reduced to the kind of status. But remember, Caldwell therefore felt that one would have felt that therefore, following Caldwell, one would have accepted that the modern democracies would have faced problem. And in India, post-47, for instance, that the government would be far more sensitive to civilian casualties. After all, we had freed ourselves from the British yoke, we were told, in 1947 when the power got transferred. So, there would have been greater, sensitivity displayed towards your own people, having suffered at the hands of the British Raj, having gone through an entire experience of what British colonial policy towards the movement for freedom was until 1947. But we didn't learn, and those wars carried on, and they were as brutal and barbaric. Just because they have not been recorded or documented adequately doesn't mean that therefore we are not obligated to return and understand what happened. Just like in Hyderabad, after the military operation, more than 200,000 Muslims are massacred, are allowed to be massacred by the Indian army by encouraging the Hindu right-wing forces, especially RSS and all. Now it is excused by very many of the Indian historians by saying that, well, this was in retaliation of what the Razakars had done in the previous era. That's not the point. The point is, once military established the control, the Indian army did the same thing that the Sri Lankan army carried out in Sri Lanka against the Tamils. So there is a context. The war and its context are very important to understand. But what is even more important for understand is what lies behind war. Clausewitz said the war is continuation of politics as well as policy. Absolutely correct. So what politics and what policies are being carried out by these wars that the Indian state has fought against its own people? And what does it involve? Before I enter into why war, the government of India denies officially that there are any wars or armed conflict taking place in any part of the country. That all that is happening is police action. The Hyderabad operation was a police action. It was not an army military operation, it was a police action. By saying that it's a police action, we seem to reduce the impact which a military annexation would have. If we are truthful intellectually, we would say it's a military annexation which took place. Whatever be the reason, in actual fact it was a military annexation. Nizam's forces were defeated and the Indian army took over control of Hyderabad. So it was a military annexation. But no, to bring it and make people immune and probably unaware of what was actually carried out in the course of those wars, therefore, was lost on the people, and Indian intelligentsia and Indian scholarship, therefore there is a big lacuna in analyzing the nature of the Indian state post 1947. This is even more interesting, friends, because if you realize one of the most important things in India that we face today, and we realize in the course of our struggle for civil liberties, is that we started in 1980s when we began aware of these problems and started looking at Northeast, Manipur and other places and where Armed Forces Special Powers Act was in operation. We thought that it was only Armed Forces Special Powers Act that we had to deal with, and its mere repeal, that calling for its repeal would help bring about the kind of transformation or end the war or armed conflict in these areas. It's only in the later years that we realize that mere repeal of Armed Forces or Special Powers Act will not do. In fact, it's so deeply, legal immunity is deeply embedded in Indian law, and it draws its strength from Indian Constitution. That is the point that we have to be aware of. That we believe the Indian Constitution says equality before law, but in armed conflict areas of India, which the government of India denies that there are any armed conflict going on, the actual reality is that the people have been deprived of their rights. And what does the right, elementary right mean? If a right in a bourgeois democracy is right to life, liberty and property, is a fundamental right, inalienable right also, according to the, in a bourgeois state, then it means that your recourse to a criminal court for redressal of a grievance, if you have suffered at the hands of the state forces, that you would have access to that, right? In India, the actual condition in Jammu and Kashmir, northeast of India, and as well as in 9 states of India where the Operation Greenland is going on, that is not the case. So you have practically 136 districts out of 630 where equality of law doesn't exist, and in fact there is legal immunity provided to the security forces. Legal immunity simultaneously as citizens or people are denied the right of access to a criminal court by very simple stratagem. So even if Armed Forces Special Powers Act is removed for our Indian statute, the Army Act and equivalent acts of paramilitary formation in India, which are called the Armed Forces of the Union by the Indian Constitution, their charters, if you look at it and read it, and these materials are available on the website, so anybody can look at it. I've also written some on this issue. We'll show you that all these charters, in all these areas where armed conflict going on, it's the forces which have the right to decide whether they will refer the matter to a criminal court or to their own court martial, in the case of army, or the general security forces court for the paramilitary forces. It's their right to decide. That is one. Second is Like Army Act 126 says that the magistrate, a judicial magistrate, has a right to refer a matter to itself on its own recognition if it feels that there is a charge sheet to be made, and rather than the army, I want the hearing to take place in my courtroom. While that right is given, simultaneously it is said that in order for that magistrate then to carry on and begin the trial, you require the sanction of the central government, which is never in common. There is not a single instance where the government of India has sanctioned prosecution in any case where armed forces personnel have been implicated. Which means that there is no equality before law. So when we are talking about the Kashmiris, forget about their right to self-determination, which is a legitimate democratic right of theirs. Forget about that. Much before we can even enter the terrain, the basic fact is that these people are even denied equality before law. They are without any law, protection of law or hope. Now in this state, in such a state of affair which prevails in more than 136 districts out of 630 districts of India, it's not a small population that replies and therefore gets affected by it. That is one thing that has to be kept in mind. But why war? Why is it that the government of India decides to wage war, therefore obliges us to go back into the history of these struggles? You cannot just remain at the level of say, oh, let these violations that are taking place stop, or that these perpetrators be brought to justice. Whether it happens or not, that's a separate matter, because Indian Supreme Court there is a famous Supreme Court judgment in India which is called the Patribal judgment, which has provided a third layer of immunity for the armed forces. The judgment says, and it's a very interesting judgment, both for its prose and for the kind of the eloquence with which it comes in the aid of security forces and provides legal immunity for itself. It says that it would be presumed that all soldiers and all personnel of the armed forces are working in good faith. And this presumption of good faith cannot be dislodged cannot be dislodged unless there is prima facie evidence, which shows that there is evidence to show that there is some crime that has been committed, a war crime, a crime against humanity has been committed. But in order for that magistrate to take cognizance of that matter, he requires the sanction of the central government. So what the Patribal judgment did was, and this is a very interesting case, let me give you the historical background of this case for you to understand how repulsive the Supreme Court judgment is. Now what is Patribal judgment? Patribal judgment was on March 30th, if my memory serves, March 25th or 26th, on the eve of Bill Clinton's visit to India. There was a massacre that took place of Sikhs in Chhattisgarh village of South Kashmir in the district of Anantnag. 36 Sikhs were massacred. Now, who was behind it is, there are many suspects in that. Yes. Lashkar-e-Taiba and was suspected in that, as along with, according to the eyewitness statements of those survivors of the Chhattisgarh massacre, it could have been even army men or rogue elements from within the army. Now, after that, the army started searching for the so-called perpetrators of this massacre. And in the course of that, they picked up a lot of local villages. Scores of them were picked up. On 5 days after Chhattisgarh massacre, the army announced that there was an encounter in which they had killed 5 of the foreign militants who were involved in the Chhattisgarh massacre. And they also released the name of 3 of those foreign militants, gave the name as Pakistanis with the name, rank, etc., etc. Obviously, the army claimed that it had this evidence that they had collected from the encounter. Fine. in this, just after this encounter, some of these villages started protesting, and they came and complained to they tried to lodge a complaint with the police saying that their kith and kin had been abducted by the army and they don't know the whereabouts of these people. So please, we like to know. And we fear that maybe those 5 foreign militants that the army claimed that it killed and were involved in Chatti Singpura could be our kith and kin who were there, so we would like. This procession was fired upon, 7 people were killed by the police and fired on these protesters who were demanding a probe into this and bringing the perpetrators to justice. Now moved by that, and because Bill Clinton was arrived, and obviously as you know the Indian establishment is so very concerned about international bad press and things like that, and with Bill Clinton's arrival they decided the magistrate or judicial magistrate order in investigation. The investigation established that the army claims are false. They found that there is reasons to believe that these people were not foreigners, that they were locals, and they asked that the DNA testing be done, etc. It's an interesting story because there are all twists and turns. Then CBI, after 2 years of this investigation and commission of inquiry that went on and things like that, finally Central Bureau of Investigation, which is supposed to be the premier investigating agency in India, was given the task of investigating the matter. They discovered that the DNA blood samples that had been taken had been fudged by the head of the Department of Pathology of the Government Medical College, Srinagar. That was the first that they were trying to already fudge to ensure that this link between local villages and those people who are buried there as foreign militants doesn't get established. So they tried to prevent it by juggling with the fudging the DNA testing. Finally, this was discovered and new blood samples were done, which established that these people were related to the family which claimed that their kith and kin had been disappeared by the army. The CBI, after an army, of course, challenged CBI's right to investigate a crime committed by them. They're saying that this was a joint police-army action. And what they were doing was only at the behest of the police, which provided them with the intelligence. They didn't know who XYZ is. Okay, that was their claim of innocence. Anyway, the CBI, finally the matter went to the Supreme Court. That is when the Supreme Court intervened to say this. So much so, then in a general court martial or in general security force court, civilians who are affected have no locus standi. They have no locus standi. Which means that if they want to intervene during the court martial, they can't. They can't come with their own lawyer and intervene and ask questions. That is denied to them. Quite apart from that, after the court martial proceedings, if they have no right to demand those documents of that court proceedings so that they can take it and move the Supreme Court. Okay? Even that door is closed because the army says civilians have no locus standi. In our court, the security forces say the same thing. Civilians who are affected therefore do not have any access even to an impatriable case. It's very interesting. After 12 years of all this, today the victims are fighting to get copy of this, what army calls the summary of evidence of this case. Now the reason I'm narrating this case is that it resulted in the Supreme Court judgment and it provided another layer of legal immunity, which raises a lot of issues for us.
So the case in the Supreme Court was by the people, or what exactly was it?
I'm sorry?
So can you tell us, like, what
the
was
army
case?
went in appeal against the CBI right to investigate. And they challenged. Then they challenged, I mean, this is an history
So
also.
it's army versus CBI. Again, people are...
Yeah. And the Union of India, it's interesting that the CBI was always on the side of the security forces because you can't afford to demoralize the security forces. They're so very important for the Indian nation state, please remember. In fact, there is a Supreme Court judgment in a very famous case called Masooda Parveen case, where the Supreme Court refused to give ex gratia payment of rupees 50,000, not even $1,000. 50,000 rupees would be how many dollars? Less than $800?
Yes.
They didn't refuse to give even $800 to the wife of a civilian victim who was killed, bombed actually by the army. And she approached the Supreme Court. She didn't go to the lower court. She didn't go to the High Court. She went straight to the Supreme Court, saying that I have 2 small children. All I want is rupees 50,000 as ex gratia payment to bring up my kids. The army said, the Supreme Court, in a famous judgment, says that we cannot do that because this would demoralize the security forces. So demoralization of the security forces is a very important part. And today we have gone a step further. For the first time we have declared, the government of India has declared, that any soldier who dies fighting his own people will be considered a martyr, exactly like an army soldier fighting on the border against an enemy. So if you fight against your own people who are reduced to enemy, you can become a shaheed and a martyr and be entitled to a whole lot of privileges and things like that. The reason I'm bringing all this up is to just point out that because of our unwillingness to address the issue of war, we do not understand that the wars that are taking place, what is happening in those places. And just because we abhor war, we don't even want to delve into this whole armed conflict that is going on, and therefore don't even want to go into the background as to what first started, what lies behind it. And that is where I want to come in. There are multiple wars that are going on, of course, Manipur, Kashmir, and each one, if you go to the history, you will understand. In 1949, Manipur was annexed. It was annexed under very fictitious circumstances. I mean, if you go into details, all this information is available today on the website. If you look at the history of the annexation of Manipur and how it comes about, what happened and what triggered, what was the demand. Way back in 1947 itself, in large parts, I mean in Naga areas and in Manipur areas, people were demanding the right of self-determination, or not right of self-determination in such categoric terms as the right to be independent, and therefore to enter into negotiation with government of India for a peaceful resolution of this issue. They tried hard. The Nagas did it, the Manipuris did it, and every other people have done in India. Before the Indian state decides, say enough is enough. We are a nation state in making, and our project demands that we will not tolerate anybody to even dream of seceding from it. I mean, this is, nation states have this long history. The tragedy is for us that in a post-colonial society, that same history, a new history did not inform our conduct. And in 21st century, we are still carrying on with the old practices of the nation states without trying to think in terms of another way out of this. And this is very relevant to what I'm talking about. Let's begin. Today is also happens to be the 16th anniversary of Salyan massacre in Poonch districts of Jammu and Kashmir. It's the 16th anniversary of it. This was an incident in which the Indian Army went, massacred villages, not just massacred, then mutilated their bodies so that they could not be recognized. And these perpetrators are the people who were implicated in this crime, then went on not only to get a service medal for brilliant, job in the counter-insurgency operations and all, but they rose up in the rank, and some of them occupy very senior posts in the security establishment today. But what is the history? I mean, if you begin with the history of Kashmir, I mean, it's a partition issue to begin with in its origin, which ought to have been resolved peacefully and democratically at that point, to have spared us the kind of bloodletting that went on later. And we would say that about the Naga areas, about the Mizo areas, about the Manipur, about each and every war, that there was a possibility of another way of solving it right when it began. But that was not the option that the Indian nation state chose. It chose military suppression, exactly at the Brit center. It chose military suppression. It took 40 years before Kashmiris took up arms. It took several years before Nagas. I mean, it was only in 1950s that the Nagas picked up arms. Manipuris, of course, resisted right from the beginning, because they had, in the intervening period before Manipur was annexed to India, they came out with an extremely radical and revolutionary constitution. They tried to establish some kind of a socialist, a more egalitarian system in Manipur. So they chose to stand up and fight right from the beginning when the war was imposed on them and Manipur was annexed. And if we come to the most recent, the war, Operation Demon, that is taking place in the 9 states of India, which is the largest, then you find that this step up begins around the turn of this new millennium with the decision, a very concrete, deliberate decision taken by the Indian state that they have to open up the forest area for mining sectors, because it's essential and critical for India's growth story. That is how Dr. Manmohan Singh justified the step up in the war against the Maoists. And this is now reached another level. Now they're not even talking about the issues that were thrown up by the war in the earlier phase. The issue of land, forest rights, water, or the privatization of water, or the struggle over water, land. These issues have receded in the background, and today the Maoists, because why? Government of India has already solved it by bringing out Forest Rights Act, Land Acquisition Act, etc., etc. Therefore, where is the need to address any of these issues anymore? All we need to do is stamp out the Maoists who are coming in the way of development now. And with the Narendra Modi government in power, the practices which started under UPA 1 and 2 have come to full, how should I say, full maturity and an open a condition of total war, where for the first, in a very organized fashion, helicopter gunships, etc., are going to be used against the Maoists in there, what are considered the forest heartlands, in order to crush them. The idea behind crushing Maoists, of course, is not just because they dare to dream of transforming or capturing power. They are way behind. I mean, whatever they want to do. The point is, currently, if you look at the size, if you look at the area where they are, the fact that they have been elevated to the status of the biggest internal threat. But if you look at it deeply, you discover that it's not. There is nothing that suggests that it's such a big threat, unless anyone who challenges the order and inspires people to fight back, and therefore has the capacity of attracting those who are dissatisfied by struggles which are reaching nowhere, or where it has come to a standstill, like POSCO. Now it is openly talked about that a number of youths are being attracted to pick up guns. What do you expect people to do? It's this situation that one is talking about. So if you remove the social context, if you remove the history of that struggle, and you do not understand that, and you just talk about that these people are just decided to take up arms and this is wrong, this is immoral, this is unethical, people not to take it up, and there are constitutional means available, there is parliament, there is elections, etc., 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 we run into a lot of problems. So the simple things, BJP government gets 2/3 majority in the parliament on the basis of 70% of vote. How is that possible? 34% of people did not participate in vote. Out of the 66% who participate, 31% only voted in favor of BJP, which is actually 17% of the population which has voted for BJP and given them 2/3 majority, so they can ride roughshod over anything and they can pass legislations or tweak legislations that have been passed in the past. Therefore, the labor laws are coming under attack. The Forest Rights Act were already coming under attack in the UPA 2 government. They had begun to tweak. So the rights of the Gram Sabhas, of the village community, and especially the tribal communities, have already slowly been taken away. They've been divested. Gram Sabha or the village community no longer. Their word is not the last word. Their consent is not the last word in terms of divesting forest land for non-forest use. You'll be surprised to know, and that was supposed to be the key issue, the key, how should I say, the provision that the Forest Right Act was to provide. How did they manage this? They managed it by tweaking the rules. There is one thing which is the act, but there is another thing which is the rules which are framed by the bureaucrats. It's only when the rules are framed that the law gets enforced. So it lays down the manner in which the law has to apply. Okay?
When did this happen?
So it's in the last 1 year, a small amount of tweaking has been going on, and you look at the full impact. Now the Land Acquisition Act, which was passed with much fanfare, and which was supposed to have, what happens to that? They're already thinking in tweaking it. They're going to divest the project affected. The definition of the project affected is also being loosening, so those who are not landholders but work on that land are going to be affected adversely, etc., etc., etc. So this tweaking is going on. So we believe, people fight, struggles takes place. The parliament or the political parties wakes up to it and says, okay, we'll come out with a progressive legislation. That legislation, when it is moved, meets opposition, it gets diluted. There is another round of battle. Then the standing committee comes into the play, those recommendations are incorporated, and a slightly better version of Forest Right Act comes into existence. Then becomes a struggle over the rules. It takes more than 2 years before the rules get framed. So by the time the rules get framed and the law gets enforced, many things have already changed in the act. One part of the anti-Maoist campaign is also this called the Integrated Action Plan. Integrated Action Plan was supposed to have resulted into a big conflict between Planning Commission and the Ministry of Home Affairs. Over what? The Planning Commission said that the Gram Sabha should be brought into playing the critical role in disbursement of funds under the Integrated Action Plan in order to wean away the people from the markets. Okay? A very clever policy. Ministry of Home Affairs said no. We can't do that. It would mean that we distrust our administrators, our bureaucrats. You can't have that. So now, the district magistrate, the superintendent of police, and the district forest officers are the three who control the disbursement of Integrated Action Plan funds. Okay? So you have already tweaked the Forest Rights Act and other acts. It's in these conditions these wars are taking place. So when in looking at wars, we are not just looking at how they fight. Yes, it's of much interest how they fight, and I'll come to that issue later. But it's also interesting why these wars are taking place. Because then we understand the politics of it and what it aims to achieve. Of course, wars in India are different kinds of wars and different levels of wars are being framed. I have not even talked about, here I am talking only about armed conflict. There is another war which is being fought in the name of fighting terror, which through an act called Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967 in India, which has been modified many times over and which has incorporated all the provisions, draconian provisions of TADA and POTA, earlier draconian acts, is one of the biggest threats to us because it completely, its impact is such that it creates a crime. I mean, this is something which is brought out also by this book that I'm reading, The New Jim Crow, which brings out how the drug war, the declaration of drug war. At a time, I mean, on the eve of drug war, only 2% of crimes were apparently where drug figured as in any way. So it was hardly anything. Once the drug war began, you created a crime and you see a proliferation of incidents and offenders. This is exactly the same thing Unlawful Activities Prevention Act does. So for instance, just to give you an example, and to complete this story and move on to the last section, let's look at what happens to student Islamic movement of India. Okay, 2001 September 11 happened on 27th September of 2001. Then party in power, NDA, with L.K. Advani as the Home Minister. They declared the SIMI is a banned organization. Now, until then, the unlawful, I'm sorry I'm going to bore you with some of legalese, but please hang on with me because it's very important. You must know the nature of the beast in order to be able to, in order to think in terms of solutions or how to overcome it. We must know. So, SIMI. So, in 27 September 2001, they declared it.
What is the reason?
Until then, they cite the reason. This is also really brilliant. All they come out with is a single page gazette notification saying that our suspicion is that SIMI is engaged in supporting the Kashmiri Muslims, that they support jihad, etc., etc. Now, until 2001, the only reason for banning an organization is if you preach secession. Okay. So they tried to bring in rope in SIMI because there was no other law. They tried to rope in SIMI because the intention was to ban SIMI. So they brought it under by saying that they had supported jihad in Kashmir and that they were implicated in providing material and moral support for the secessionist movement in Kashmir. Many of us do it. I do it. It's not as if SIMI was the only one. And even if we did it, heavens wouldn't have fallen if they had continued to do it. I mean, it's hardly anything. Why should we not support the right of self-determination of Kashmiri people? I mean, one should ask this question. Why is it the Indians are not supporting that? I mean, my distress is that not more Indians are supporting rather than why few Indians are doing it. Anyway, so they were roped in and they were banned. Until then, there was not a single criminal case which had reached the stage of conviction anywhere against any member of SIMI. The only cases which were registered against SIMI until then, 2001, were where they clashed with Bajrang Dal and other Hindu right-wing elements. And of course, the Indian peculiarity of Indian law is that whereas the Muslims were charge-sheeted, the Hindu Bajrang Dal and RSS escaped. This is also a peculiarity of majoritarian Indian state. It would be like Afro-Americans here perhaps, an equivalent situation. So this is what happened. So until 2001 there were hardly any cases, no convictions had taken place. So there was not even an history that one could say and the government could provide by saying that, SIMI is a dangerous organization, it has committed these kind of crimes, etc., etc. Whatever they were preaching, I mean, is nothing very different from what RSS or others. I mean, if the worst comes to worst, even if they wanted to establish Nizam-e-Mustafa in India, so what? It's their right to preach what they believe in and propagate what they believe in. At that level, why should there be a problem? And in fact, one would argue that as long as it's in public domain, it's still possible to engage with them. Dialogue, have conversation, right? By banning them, what you did is drove them inside. But there was a much more serious one. One, as I said, exactly like the drug war, you now created a crime. You declared that since SIMI is banned, anybody associated with it, and anyone who remotely espouses the same ideas the SIMI does. So SIMI became a generic name for anyone who spoke out in favor of Muslim assertion in India. Okay? And this was enabled by a law. If drug war enabled it for the Afro-Americans and resulted and helped in mass incarceration, then in India, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, insofar as the Muslims are concerned, has done more or less the same thing. We may not have reached. I mean, Indians, probably right-wing Indians, lament the fact that we don't have 2 million in prisons and that we have far too few in Indian prisons, and they would probably like to compete with United States of America to probably have 20 million in competition, But that's a separate issue. But the point is, what it does is that it completely criminalizes a large part of legitimate activities that even the Constitution and we are told that we all enjoy. Now the reason I'm saying is that there are different levels at which wars are being fought. So the war against terror takes one shape. Armed conflict, it takes another shape, where there are armed clashes. But it makes a difference also for us to look closely at wars to understand who's fighting it, what are the specificities of it, to also understand, because one of the arguments, one of the important things that we have to keep in mind is that why is it that, quite apart from the fact that people are forced to pick up, or situations are created where they feel compelled that they have no choice but to pick up weapons to defend themselves. It's the right of self-preservation and right of self-defense. I mean, an Adivasi whose land or his forest is going to be taken over by a big corporate for mining, and his livelihood and his life is going to be destroyed because of it, and for future generations. Obviously, he or she will pick up and fight. So, that itself is not surprising. What is that every movement and every war that has taken place in India also throws up different social realities. Like the war that was fought in Kashmir is different from the nature from what is happening in Operation Greenland area. Not in terms of the state's response, but I'm talking in terms of the rebels, the militants, the so-called militants, the insurgents. We have to also understand, because it's very important to understand also those who have been turned into enemy. Because once you are turned into enemy, you are demonized by media. If you look at Times Now, for instance, they have 2 series called Red Thunder 1 and 2. Please check it out. Then you get an idea about how pernicious and how the nature of propaganda and the clamor for more harsh measures. We pride ourselves in a very non-violent country. I mean, there is no other country which is more violent than India. There is no civilization which has been as unequal and as violent as Indian civilization, which is also a fact. We fear, we do not want to confront certain realities, at least in India. But it's a fact that we have to confront ourselves. In this situation, it matters why people are fighting, how they are fighting, and what does it reflect about their politics. Wars also become a way in which you understand the nature of the struggle and the resistance and the way in which, because if they were just rabble-rousers, if these were just people who were interested in picking up guns for the heck of it and kill for the heck of it, that would be one thing. That would be thirsting for bloodthirsty. Revenge also dies down. I mean, you're motivated by revenge, you want to take revenge for somebody who's been killed close to you, fine. But how long does revenge or the motive for revenge last? You can't sustain yourself for a very long time, and in fact you may therefore end up taking up issues and working in a way in which does greater harm to you than and to the movement and the struggle than anything else. So there are many issues that also throw up. And one of the most important issues that for any soldier and for any army, either state or for the militants, is a question of motivation. What motivates people? How do you sustain motivation? And what is the nature of difference between the motivation of a soldier and a rebel? It's this that war also encourages and obliges us to do. Why? Indian Army is considered, there's a brilliant book by Philip Mason on British Indian Army and its history, how it came into being. It's a brilliant book. It's supposed to be a classic untold. Philip Mason's called British Indian Army. Anybody who's interested in it should check it out. One of his important theses is how British succeeded in creating a mercenary force. A mercenary force which could even offer its life while it is working for cash, that it could sacrifice its life for regimental honor, for the honor and pride of the officer who commanded it. So they made Indian Army, the British Army, made mercenary a very honorable term. That's why you had 75,000 British officers and 150,000 Indian soldiers could control 350 million Indians. You needed local support, and you had plenty of it. The same, one would have expected post 47 the things ought to have changed. Then the composition would have changed. That the representative character of the army and the forces would have undergone a change. That the wars against our own people would not have taken place. Right? There would be other ways in which you would be able to negotiate and resolve those issues. That did not happen. What did in fact happen is, therefore, the wars became a problem. Now, so motivation is a very, very important issue. So why is it? When you look at, it's a weak force, it's a small force compared to the Indian state, which is fighting against, say for instance, the Maoists in 9 states of India. The number of districts now where from the excess of 200, I mean there was a point where the Indian government went into hyperbole and claimed that 260 districts have reported Maoist or Naxal activities, etc., etc. So whatever remotely happened was all brought in. Now they've brought it down to 80 districts. But 80 districts is not a small number, spread over 9 states. And with more than between 300,000 to 400,000 Indian troops, comprising different kind, border security forces, central paramilitary forces, Indo-Tibetan border police, national security guards, then the what is called the state armed forces. These are all armed police trained by the British. You know, Robert Peel did a wonderful thing for the colonized people. He brought in community policy for England. But the same Robert Peel was the founder of community policy in England in the 19th century, also propounded this new concept of policing for colonies, and which was modeled on the Irish constabulary, a paramilitary formation. Paramilitary formation which is trained like an infantry battalion of the army. So when we talk about police in India, and even when you look at a budget, there is this category that appears in the Ministry of Home Affairs written police. So we think that these are civilians, you know, the police, bed and wearing, maybe with a pistol or something, but these are not. These are heavily armed. And these police forces have the kind of weaponry which rebels, can only dream of. All kind of weaponry which is available. Now fight this force with what? Only 3 weapons that are available to the guerrillas. So the motivation, it becomes even more important for them. And what are those 3 weapons? AK-47s, which is the weapon favorite of the rebels world over. Thanks to Kalashnikov, he popularized a weapon which in the hands of a rebel made him so much more effective in close combat. IED, improvised explosive devices, and AK-47, IED. There's a third.
Handmade bomb?
I'm sorry?
House-made bomb?
No, those would be considered part of IEDs. It'll just come to me. These are the only 3, broadly, these are the 3 weapons generally used by world over, primarily by and grenade launchers. These are the 3 weapons that generally the guerrillas have used against a very formidable force.
Grenade launchers have been used in India?
Sorry?
Grenade launchers have been used in
Yeah.
RPGs.
And in fact, the guerrillas use it themselves also. They made out...
the RPGs you mean, rocket propelled grenades.
Yeah, but these are all looted from the armories. Please understand that 95% of all the weapons in the possession of the Maoists, and now the Kashmiri insurgents, which they have learned from the Maoist style, I think, is that now they don't have to import or purchase from international arms trade. There's so much of weapon in the armories. It's looting them that provides you. So RPGs and all have not, because they bought it, because these have been looted from the armories and it has come into their possession. That's why. These are the 3 major. But these weapons are not the mainstay of any movement, no matter what we say. Because with this weapon, when you're fighting a formidable enemy, which is, the Indian Intelligence Bureau claims, according to their latest figure of how many Maoists there are, they have brought it down to saying that there are 4,000 armed cadres. Against them, if you have 300,000 to 400,000, it's a very formidable. I mean, it's virtually 1 to 100. One rebel for 100 soldier for one rebel, which is double the what is advocated in classical counter-insurgency doctrines. They say 50 should be the maximum, 30 to 50. 50 is the upper limit. In India, we have gone, and it's going to keep on increasing, because that is the Indian contribution to counter-insurgency, by the way. That's a separate story, but it's interesting. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not the nature of the weapons counts, it's the people and their motivation, what they are fighting for, and how they fight, because they don't have wages. I mean, a Maoist rebel doesn't join the PLGA for money. When he is recruited, he is told the only thing you'll gain is the love and respect of the people. And that is what we are asking you to join. You won't get wages. You won't get any of the privileges that the soldier of the CRPF or others enjoy. And compare and contrast the motivation of the CRPF soldiers which are deployed to fight against the Maoists, and look at the motivation of the Maoists, and then tell me whether it doesn't tell you a story also about how determined are the people to fight despite knowing that they're fighting a formidable force, a mighty force. And their chances of victory are not certain. But they look at the way in which they fight, and look at the level of motivation and lack of it amongst the paramilitary forces, because people want, I mean, this is another part of the story. Why is it that people join paramilitary forces? Why is it the largest number of jobs in the government sector in India is being opened up in the armed police and armed services, not in post and telegraph, not in Indian Railways. In Indian Railways, there is vacancies of more than 100,000 vacancies, which were not filled. In Post and Telegraph Department, which is another very big department, I mean millions, I mean Indian Railways employs
1.6 million people.
1.6 million people directly, and probably an equivalent amount indirectly. It's a huge manpower that is employed. Look at the employment generation and the vacancies that are left there, and where new posts are being created, and look at where the budget allocations are going, and it tells you a story also that people are being encouraged, that the only jobs opportunities that are coming by them in larger numbers than other places is in the armed services. So you have, in army has a recruitment rally for say 200 posts, you will have 25,000 people lined up. There's such desperation for jobs. So people just join because it's a government service. They're oblivious of the war and where they'll be deployed. It's when they get recruited and then they get deployed in these war zones and they fight, then suddenly they say, we sign to fight, but we don't know who we are fighting. And they've also complained that it's to fight amongst people where we can't distinguish between a guerrilla and a civilian is impossible for us. So it's not as if the soldiers are all zombies or they are heartless or... No, that's not the point. But I'm saying is that their motivation therefore is very different. And this contrast. Now in such a war therefore, to make it more impersonal therefore is what is going to happen increasingly in order to make up for the lack of motivation. So you increase and improve the arsenal that is provided to them that can cause greater havoc. Get my point? So this is what is happening. So what do we do? What is art? I mean, as a civil liberties person, what do I do? I mean, here is a reality of what that is taking place amongst us. There is a reality that the law is crafted and has been crafted in such a manner that anyone who falls foul of it, it's like triple felony in California, I'm told, where if you have 3 hits, 3 strikes and you're gone.
Yeah.
So it's something like that in India. It's this situation that we are confronted with, where there is no equality before law. There are laws that they have created crimes and delegitimized activities for a vast section of population. There are issues that are dying to be addressed, which are not being addressed. I mean, the new government has declared that it is going to be committed to opening up of the forest area. They are going to encourage, yes, the difference between the UP and NDA comes in here. In comparison, and only in relative terms, by the way, I'm not talking in absolute terms, only in relative terms, this is a much more national bourgeois or capitalist oriented. You know, the attractiveness of the national bourgeoisie which attracted the Marxist and left at one time, it's this national capitalist that is being backed by the BJP and the right wing today. And if you look at their policy at different levels, for instance, the defense industries, the insurance, you see how they are moving ahead. While they're opening, they're also protecting the interests of the national capital, and especially in the defense sector, and which, by the way, ties up with what I began, Israel, as being bankrolled by India. I mean, apart from United States backing for Israel, it is the Indian arms purchase which subsidizes Israel's arms lobby, which has played an extremely important role. And today, with the new change in defense industrial policy under the NDA, the public-private partnership model, which would encourage even 100% owned foreign companies, and it is primarily aimed at attracting Israeli armament units for large-scale production for Indian use. But that's a different thing. The point I'm trying to make is that it's in these situations, of these, I mean, it's the gravity of the problem that confronts us. If you look at it carefully, you discover that there are so many dimensions to it. There are so many aspects that it brings out. And there are so many issues that it is trying for us to address, that it's impossible for us to turn our back into these armed conflicts that are going on and not look at the politics behind it, look at the issues that they are trying to suppress in the name of, by demonizing it and by characterizing it as a law and order problem or police action or fighting terrorists, etc., and encouraging us to divert our attention from the real issues into side issues. I'll end here because I think I've spoken for longer than Dipankar, but I apologize for that. But I thought that I'll at least like to sum up, bring my presentation, make my presentation in such a way that I cover the major areas and then open it up for discussion. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if I can just have a glass of water, or if you can tell me where I can get it. Sorry, I interrupted you. You had a question.
So I just the class aspect to the recruitment, because on one hand there are always the stampedes at these army recruitment rallies. On the other hand, army does not have enough officers because kids who go to college or come from middle class families, they are not applying to.
There is water fountain right here.
Okay. Just give me a minute. No, that's a major problem. And one of the reasons why it's a major problem is also because young captains, second lieutenants and majors, the number of casualties suffered by them in...
Sorry, I also didn't get the question.
The army is having problems while they get a lot of people as soldiers.
Yeah.
As far as the officers are concerned, they're finding a shortage of officers.
13,000 shortfall of 13,000 officers.
13,000. And these are very, very important because please remember that it's second lieutenant to colonel, full colonel, who actually participate in battles. Above colonel, you know, it's different. So their presence in battlefront or in operations becomes of critical importance. So shortage of officers of that rank means that discipline suffers, officer personnel relationships suffer, and the number of cases of fratricide, fragicide, suicides, officer rank clashes that have taken place between is all a result of this breakdown. But this also happens when the army or the security forces are deployed against our own people. They're bound to be. They're bound to degrade and degenerate. It's bound to happen. It's intrinsic. It's given in that situation. For instance, I mean, I haven't referred to it, but war and politics also brings out, I mean, in talking about war, it also brings out very, very clearly the nature of the transformation of India. There was a time when the Indian soldiers who went and fought in Crimea and First World War, and came back. Realizing, having overcome this racial inferiority which they suffered, they saying that they could fight as well as a white man, and came back. And the victory of Japan against the Russian it created a great sense of accomplishment amongst a lot of Asiatic people. This was the context within which it happened, and these people traveled. These were the Gadarites. These were also the pioneers of the communist movement. These are the people who went to Russia, etc., etc., etc. That is the history of Indian soldiers at once upon a time. The soldiers today were coming from Kashmir, where they're fighting Kashmiri Muslims. Now imagine a situation where an Indian soldier, there are 600,000 Indian troops in Kashmir, 300,000 Indian army alone, 1,25,000 police and special police officers of J&K who are armed police. And there are another more than 150 to 200,000 at least other paramilitary formation of CRPF, border security forces. So imagine 600,000 troops. There is no other country, there is no other place where you have such a heavy deployment of soldiers. Right? Now imagine when you're sent, I mean there are so many questions that come to us. I mean when they are briefed, these soldiers are briefed and sent. They must be told something. Now what are they being sent for? Who their enemy is? How they distinguish? Okay? So obviously the brief is that they're fighting a proxy war. It's Pakistan they're fighting, which means that the Kashmiri Muslims become potentially a Pakistani. And our love, Indians' love for an Indian soldier's love for Pakistanis is, everybody knows. If Pakistanis behead Indian soldiers also behead Pakistani soldiers. Act as bestially as we do. I mean, they're the same people. Don't expect anything different from us. We fight in the same brutal fashion against each other. But Kashmir is not a proxy war. It is not a war that has been fomented by Pakistan. It is a war that goes back to 1947 because of the unresolved nature of it and because of the way in which Kashmiris have been treated and a majoritarian have been imposed. Just look at it today. That NDA government comes up and the only two policies they announce are meant for whom? Kashmiri Pandits and the Jammu Hindus. Kashmiri Muslims who have suffered in the last 25 years are completely out of it. There's not a single thing being done for them. It's a stark factor. You can talk about secularism in India and keep on moaning that BJP has come in. I'm afraid communalism didn't just come with BJP. Even under UPA 1 and 2 it was there. And the state practiced it. We talk about a political party and its formation. I believe that the Indian state is fomenting communalism and encouraging communalism. Look at the social composition of the Indian army. 2% Muslims. And you deploy this force of non-Muslims in a Muslim majority area and you expect them to treat the civilians with any degree of civility or sensitivity or empathy. Especially if you've been told that it's a proxy war you're fighting against Pakistan. There are a lot of issues therefore with that war compels us to address and bring out. And you start looking into things, you start looking into all these issues which we've never raised. Why should we raise the question of representational character of the state institutions? Why is it that the Indian institutions, it's so easy for any government, right-wing government to come and they suddenly discovered that all the laws, all the institutions are there for them to do whatever they want to and everybody falls in love. How is it possible? If it doesn't derive its impetus from something that has been created for them in the last 67 years. So it's these very serious issues that when you start looking at it from the question of war and politics that throws up this. It takes us into the question, yes.
So, you talk about politics of war and I think, to a certain extent, that was what was getting these wars going on all over India, all over the world. But now as you give an example of Israel and the Israeli defense industries, and so it looks like now it's the economics that's driving all the war.
I'm sorry?
It's the economics of war. The people who are going to benefit, the whole industry that has come about. Maybe that's what is going to be driving all these conflicts in future. Keep the conflict going. There's no point in resolving any conflict because there's more money to be made by having these conflicts going on. I mean, I don't know, in context, for example, Indian Army doesn't want to withdraw from Kashmir. I think they get some benefits for being there, or what exactly is going on, and then the defense industry. So I'm wondering, what is the nature of the defense industry that's coming up in India? What kind of warfare they're engaging, like surveillance, or they're making bombs, or I don't know what exactly. I mean, somebody keeping an eye on what the trends are to kind of see how or the nature of the conflict that will happen in the future, maybe driven by these forces.
No, on the question of economics of war, very little work that has been done, and I think right now I don't think there is a very strong argument that can be made right now on the economics of war. I think the wars that we have been that have been foisted on the people have very clear political origins, and primarily in all the areas of northeastern Kashmir, it's because of the nation states' reluctance to accept any territorial change. And in fact, India has expanded physically. Its borders, its territory has expanded rather than shrunk, which is a strange thing. So that has been, and Kashmir, see, Naga issue became also as a conflict with China increased in intensity, and our fear, suspicion of China also played a role. So Naga hostiles, they were called Naga hostiles, were seen as a proxy for China virtually, or working as agents of the Chinese Communist Party. So that is the political line. But what you're saying can become a future. You see, this is the first time now, with the participation of the private sector, the possibility of emergence of a military-industrial complex now has become extremely. India is one of the largest importers of arms. So obviously, it makes sense for the Indian state and the Indian ruling classes to advocate that we have to bring down our dependence on the international arms trade. And for obvious reasons. I mean, there are so many examples. I mean, when French sold Exocet missiles to Argentina during the Falklands War, you know what happened? Margaret Thatcher's government put so much pressure on France that France had to share with Britain what is it called, the secret algorithms. I'm not a science, natural science, so please correct me.
Source code.
Source codes. They shared the Exocet missile source code with the British government. So Argentinians couldn't use the Exocet missiles against the British troops. You get my point? So obviously there is an argument that you can make. Now, taking this argument further, Government of India under UPA and UPA 2 was encouraging, and they still have these dreams of encouraging Boeing and Lockheed and others to come to India and establish big military industrial complexes, and also which would also result in some kind of collaboration and things like that. So we see the beginnings of that. And maybe in the future the privatization of the ordnance, because this government, like any other government we have had in the last 20-25 years, it's so keen on privatizing any other public assets. So it may move in that direction also, where they privatize ordnance factories. That can emerge. We already have two very big industrial houses already involved in it, and big time entry of other big corporate houses with Reliance, Larsen and Toubro. Piparav is another private company which is involved in defense sector. Tatas are already interested in it, etc., etc. So the big corporate houses in India are suddenly, with this opening up and the kind of domestic market that would be available to them, a captive market supplying to the Indian forces, would create the kind of military industrial complex, and with Israel's involvement, I mean, that's a very, very critical factor. I think encouraging Israel to set up its armament units in India to produce a much larger quantity than what they're able to do because of various other factors in Israel, the scale of production, etc., etc. There is a strong likelihood of Israel and India, that kind of a strategic alliance, which would be the way in which would establish a military industrial complex, create the kind of vested interest that you're talking about, which would generate its own interest. But what about Indian Army's reluctance to move out of, say, Assam or Jammu and Kashmir? What is that? Is it economic interest, particularly military? Power and pelf. Please understand that the Indian Army, having moved into a territory, and this is also a tradition of most armies, colonial or post-colonial, which is when they feel that they have shed blood for a territory, they don't want to retreat from that. It's there. They won it. Kashmir is something Indian Army believes it has won. It's a fruit of war. Indians treat Kashmir as a fruit of war. Look at the way in which the Indian tourists behave, and look at the way Indian soldiers behave, and look at the empathy between the two against the Kashmiri local Muslims, and you know what is happening there. We can't be oblivious of these realities. We can't talk about equality and democracy and secularism where we see the state is implicated in creating communalism, generating communalism, promoting communalism. Gujarat is one kind of phenomenon. Kashmir is another. And its impact is far greater. At times I believe that we don't even realize what it means. As you pointed out, with an officer cadre corps which has shrunk, they are unable to attract more, which means that they have to reduce the qualification levels to encourage more people to join in, and increase their wages to make it more attractive, remunerate, the compensation packages have to be very attractive, etc., etc. Or and carry on with the war, which has created problem of demotivation. It has created problem of discipline. It corrupts. The kind of corruption that has come up. We have all kind of corrupt actions where senior general army chiefs have been implicated, including in that famous Mumbai, that building where two army chiefs, one rear admiral, air force chief, acquired a house in a building which was supposed to be meant for the martyrs of Kargil. None of them were martyrs. All of them are bloody well alive, yeah. None of soldiers got that house. So the level of corruption that is seeped in. And it's bound to be there because it's so easy. This is one area which comes under scrutiny or under audit scrutiny much less. Or there is lesser control of Auditor General of India, control and Auditor General of India than in other civilian areas. So it creates, we are talking about a huge, a situation that bodes ill for us. Now, from this we may feel very pessimistic about the future and very, very troubled by what can happen and what cannot happen. So I'll just like to end on a much more encouraging note than leaving you feel very, very pessimistic. The interesting thing about India that has also happened in the last 16 years must also be kept in mind. One of them is that there has been, in the 67 years, because of all the efforts that have been made by various struggles over the last 67 years, it has contributed to democratizing the society. Not the state. The capacity of the Indian state to unleash repression is unprecedented. Its heartlessness is something we all know. Its capacity to to carry on for years together. A brutal war against our own people in one corner where people are not even aware of what is going on. But at the same time, all that has happened. But just as, we may feel helpless, that we are able to do nothing for the Gaza's victims. Right? We may feel completely helpless. And it may fill us with a sense of hopelessness and pessimism. But the other side of the picture is also very remarkable, that it hasn't stopped people from resistance, that they are not giving up. That is the remarkable story that remains to be told. That how is it that despite all the obstacles that have been placed against the POSCO movement, for instance, you pick up any movement that is going on in India, and you look at it, it's not as if they've finished or they've died. They're facing a new form of challenge and they're trying to confront it and overcome it. But it's not as if resistance has died. And in fact, the awareness and the degree of awareness and the kind of serious challenges that it faces and the openness to discuss some of these issues is relatively much better than what it was 10 years back. So it's not as if everything is hopeless. Yes, please.
Is there more space for questions? Or are you having
No, please. You have anything?
So, you said reflections on India. Could you also actually since you came to society, what is your assessment of sort of so-called Indian society? If in a political configuration, one entity within that political configuration is just brutally being massacred, then is it even logical to think of this as a cohesive society? Because if what was being done in say Chhattisgarh or Kashmir, if that same thing was done in Delhi, and more murders happen in Delhi than Manipur, right? It's probably a more dangerous place for common people. But we can't see the kind of reaction that you get from in Delhi when you have, which is more brutal, right? That's another separate problem. But so does it even make sense to talk of Indian society? Is there even something like that? That is there a morality? Is there a conscience that this thing has? Does this thing even exist?
That's a very tricky question you posed, and at one level I would say, of course, there is. As a political entity, it exists. Its laws exist. Those laws get imposed. Our reaction, our responses, our struggles are all in response to this political entity which is India. So in that sense, to deny the existence of Indian society, so to say, would not be completely accurate. But you have raised a very serious issue, that what happens? What kind of an Indian society is it that carries out massacres in one place or another and delegitimizes struggle and takes away the constitutional freedoms? How much are they part of Indian society then? And what do the other part or segments of Indian society have to say about this part of theirs which is being exposed to armed conflict and war? This is in fact the question that I'm trying to pose. There are different ways in which we address these issues. When I raise the issue of civil liberties and legal immunity, my attempt was to reach out to a much broader audience to remind them that the constitutional, for the sake of argument, if we say the Indian Constitution is very good, that it provides certain basic freedoms and protections, then we are compelled to ask that how is it that same Indian Constitution and its laws or its principles do not get applied in an armed conflict situation, and why are we oblivious of it? It is because, and I think that's where I'm saying that we have to therefore talk about war. Because by talking about Kashmir, because how is Kashmir talked about? To give you an example. Kashmir today in the Indian media is presented as things have eased up, militancy has been crushed, there are now more than 100 150 to 300 militants left in entirety of Jammu and Kashmir, for which you required 600,000 soldiers, by the way, armed to the teeth and with legal immunity. So it doesn't make sense. Obviously they're not there to fight militants. They're there to control the people. Exactly what the Israelis are trying to do in Gaza. They will not kill each and every civilian. The lesson they're driving is you give up your fight, you surrender, you submit. When this Israeli former chief of staff said, insisted that what he wanted was to, what was his thing that he used?
Mowing the grass.
Huh?
Mowing the grass.
No, not mowing. There is another. This was, he said, the Palestinians should be reduced to drug cockroaches in a bottle. Unquote. Quote, drug cockroaches in a bottle, unquote. No, I mean, this does raise a question. I agree with you that what kind of an Indian society. So I, as a civil liberties, I do talk about Indian society, and I do talk about that there is something called India, and there is a political entity, and there is Indian constitution. But we have to also look very closely and discover that this Indian constitution and this Indian entity finds no place in it for Kashmiri Muslims or Meithis or Nagas. And today, increasingly, the Adivasis who are led by the Maoists. Yesterday, it was the Dalits, a very large section of the Dalits. So it does raise a question. So what do we do? How do we respond to it? I believe that, for instance, fighting against legal immunity is to reach out to a much wider audience to inform them that no matter where you stand on the question of Kashmir, I mean, I support the right of self-determination. I am determined and I'll continue to support it till they reach. Fine. You don't want to? Fine. But then you are obligated to raise this question that can you allow a section of your own people to be subjected to this kind of a rule where they don't enjoy any justice and the forces enjoy? So the ball is in their court. The ball is in the court of those who claim that India is perfect, that Indian constitution, Indian democracy is perfect. They have to establish that how is it possible for two laws to exist. One that completely disenfranchises the Kashmiri Muslims, and another which completely legally immunizes the security forces, and they can get away with anything that they do. I mean, please understand, even a small crime in an armed conflict area, question of rape, torture, all these get aggravated in an armed conflict situation. Rape is not the rape which takes place in a peace area. In a conflict area, rape becomes something which is a deliberate policy to shame and humiliate a people. Right? Torture is also a form of, rape is also a form of torture. Torture in armed conflict area is not the same that the police tortures a suspect in the police custody. In an armed conflict area, torture is, its magnitude, its extent is such, and it is designed to again humiliate a people. Therefore, you will find a very high incidence of sodomy, of male torture victims in Kashmir. Very high incidence of sodomy. It's an attempt at shaming, humiliating. So in armed conflict area, all these crimes actually become more aggravated crimes. Now, if you can't even provide protection of law, what the hell do you expect Kashmiris to do? Why should they want to remain in part of India? Why?
In fact, that was that would be my whole thing, right? That the reason why Kashmir joined India was because he promised constitutional democracy. He promised something, and that was, I think, the whole reason why India came into being was this promise of a new kind of government. Right? Otherwise, I mean, you know, there could have been different political configurations, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that for me, it's just remarkable that people are so sensitive to. It is good. I mean, it's good that people came out, and even laws were passed, right? I mean, if you see, India has actually, if you look at the laws, some of the best laws against rape, and not completely. There's still, marital rape is still not considered rape, but I mean, still, it caused so much of a churning. People who I knew were, completely, I don't know, very, very sort of feudal or patriarchal. They had a, but see the same people when it comes to Kashmir or to even Manipur, it's the same
Or
thing.
Dalit rape. I mean, please, you are right. December 2012, people came out to protest against Nirbhaya. But Dalit girls have been raped right, left and center, right next door in Haryana, Western UP and Rajasthan, and people don't come out in those large numbers. So that's why when I started, it may have sounded provocative, but I really mean it very from deep within my heart, that the Indian civilization is based on violence of the worst kind and inequality of the worst kind. And we have to confront it, we can't avoid it. Otherwise, how do you explain the Dalit issue? How do you explain Dalit issue to me? Or to anybody? It's rooted there and we have to confront it. So the reason I'm raising these issues and trying to present it in a different way and asking people to take war seriously is not because you have to love wars. I do believe that wars resolve issues at times, because if there are no other ways, I mean, how did you expect the Vietnamese to have won their freedom from French and from the Americans without fighting? They wouldn't have got it constitutional way. They wouldn't have. So the war is not always, but when a war is fought in a country which denies the existence of it and therefore follows no law of any kind, neither international law nor domestic laws, immunizes its security forces and disenfranchises a section of the population, then you are creating a condition where people's right to decide and demand the right of self-determination is absolutely, and as thinking people, as people who believe in principles or something, we have to raise our voice against it. And we have to stand up for it. And we have to throw the ball back in the court of those who question our right and our determination to support and raise the right of self-determination, or even talk about the Maoist war and defend it as a political movement against all kind of odds. We have to do it, otherwise what's the point? Because it's only then we bring out the underlying issues which the war is trying to suppress and force us to deny. So the choice for Kashmiris, for instance, today is that they surrender. 600,000 troops have been deployed there for what? This is to ensure that they do not dare to raise their head again or demand azadi by coming out of the streets. That they know that the cost and the price that they will pay. And I have not even discussed and shared with you what kind of things they do. I mean, you read American accounts of what happens to Afro-Americans. Please, I wish that there were equivalent studies of this nature in India which would bring out how people suffer and continue to suffer. And we are oblivious of it. We don't even take account of it. So our Indianness, I mean, to complete, maybe we start interrogating our Indianness by raising these issues. That's the only way in which we can move forward and think in terms of finding some way out.
I'll just say one more thing. I think that there is a concerted effort, I don't know, maybe out of maybe it was not malicious, but there was this concerted effort, I think, after independence to make Indian nationalism into some sort of a cultural expression. If you see even the movies that, those short 5-minute patriotic songs, which are very beautiful. I mean, I like listening to them. They're very beautiful. The idea is also very beautiful, right? That all these people so different. But I think somehow that marginalizes the constitutional aspect and, even the limited radical aspect of the Indian project. Because I mean, it sort of makes it into India into some sort of a cultural entity, which it is. But that is not the point of the Republic of India. Right? The point of the Republic of India is the preamble of the Constitution. People have to internalize that. Only then I think will they start, Right now in their mind they have a map. They have a map of India, and that is, key. But I think only when people really internalize that will they start responding to.
One thing here is to be noticed what we're talking about India, that the word democracy and words in Hindi are 3 words I get: Ganatantra, Jantantra and Prajatantra. but most what I see is a Bhid Tantra. They had created mobs everywhere. The slogan, yes, 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 we love India. So all that media, some media have their own interest to create this. Politicians have to create, own this thing, oh, we love India. Yes, nothing wrong in that. I love India too. But the main thing is that these things, what you're talking about, what we're talking about, no media will ever pick up these things. Media is going to make money on the name of rape. Why the media showing now rapes more than ever? So that's what I'm saying. This Ganatantra, Prajatantra and Jantantra. Three words are there which is not an exact meaning of democracy. So the word democracy is the French and the English ideas, and we are really keep on following those things. These are not really Indian words, and there's not a really words which one India is supposed to be. Chanakya say very clear that when Jantantra come, the Janta run the whole thing. When Ganatantra come, Ganamanya Vyakti, the people who are really choose good people, they go and rule. And Prajatantra, they talk about king and the Praja. They don't talk about that one. So which Tantra we have now, that we should really find out that one, go deep into it.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting things. But then it reduces, if you reduce democracy to mobocracy, as you believe, it becomes a bhirtam, which is crowd gathering. Well, if you are affected and you have a grievance, why shouldn't people come out and protest and shout slogans? What is wrong in that? I mean, those elementary civic freedoms are not available. And in fact, this happens to be true in large parts of the country. Even in Delhi, we find it difficult to organize a demonstration anywhere outside Jantar Mantar. Jantar Mantar has become some like a zoo where we are confined.
And nobody notices really when they go over there.
So, I mean, I wish that there was Bhid Tantra. I wish that more people would come out on the street and join the protests. Unfortunately, it's the opposite that is happening. The law is creating conditions where we find it difficult to even come out and protest elementary things, to hold a protest or to distribute pamphlets. 10 years back, what we could do, we find it difficult to do. You know, in 2001, what the NDA government did, Americans had attacked Afghanistan after 2001 in December. But they filed sedition cases against people who were distributing pamphlets opposing the war that the Americans had lost. They filed sedition cases against them. I mean, this is... So the problem of our institutions, I don't think it's a mere change of law or that accepting preamble or internalizing preamble. I think it requires a major transformation of Indian state and society. We require a social revolution along with a material transformation. You know, the kind of inequality that exists in our country and the racism that exists, it calls for much larger protests, for many more people to come out and protest. I mean, I would have loved to see the 100,000 people come out protesting against the rape of Dalit girls. When they were sitting in Delhi, the Baghana, 5 women who were raped by the upper caste, they're sitting in Delhi, how many thousands of people, except for the left and progressive circles, nobody joined it. The others, the right wing, which was so active in the Nirbhaya. So that also, in the long run, that is also helpful. Because that polarization is very important also. That the right will not take you to the path of justice and equality. Right cannot take you. Only left and progressives can take you there. That is also important. We can't be oblivious of these things. So, you're right that, you know, Bhirtant may be a scary proposition, but our problem is that we don't have people coming out and protesting. My lament has been for 25 years, how many thousands have come out to protest against what was being done to Kashmiri Muslims by the Indian security forces or the Indian army, even protesting, without saying anything in the favor of their azadi, that we will not allow rape, torture and killing of anybody in Kashmir, just as we are demanding that for Gaza. Why did we not do it? Because Kashmiris know the Indian state. They don't hate Indian state as much as they hate the Indian intelligentsia for betraying them and not standing up for them. Please remember that. Sorry.
Just a small question. So, there was some discussion about what is Indian civil society and so on, and about how Indian mainstream society does not care about the issues that are happening. It's primarily because they've been constructed, like you said, as the other, and the other, whether it's Chhattisgarh or Manipur or Kashmir or Muslims, and so the other is defined in relation to the self, which is the Indian nationalistic self. You can say right now there's a Hindu nationalistic project going on, but it's not a new thing. It's been, even the Congress has that undercurrent of it. So there is a kind of ideological basis for this indifference, and now we have like Modi, who was largely forgiven for what happened in Gujarat, where it was whatever extra constitutional. So when you're talking to this majoritarian nationalist identity, the self, it's like 90% of Israelis support the ongoing offensive, right now in Gaza. So by appealing to legal constitutional principles, how much, that's one way of saying I'm trying to reason with you, whatever you agree. But shouldn't this nationalistic project itself be dismantled, like the social revolution, which, I don't know, there have been people like Phule, for example, who've been working on that. What is your take on that? I mean, the left doesn't really take on itself the project for, do you think, like, deconstructing what this means?
No,
and it's based on, like, Kashmir, for example, it's based on this continuous long-term our culture tradition, right? So kind of examining what is this culture, and you mentioned about the Indian civilization being very violent, but has there been more articulation about why that is? Other people have tried to articulate that, about examining Indian society and what the contradictions are.
I'm sure that everybody has. I mean, I have no scholarship of that nature. I'm just responding to it on the basis of my own understanding, having worked a little bit of reading. So I'm drawing on that. I don't have any scholarship which establishes, what I'm saying. So I could, in fact, be dismissed by some scholar by saying that that's absurd. But I'll still stick to it because I do not believe that the Hinduism offers within itself and in its fold, the way in which it has been imagined and has evolved, the possibilities of equality. So at that level, it comes easy. Self and the other comes easy to Indians, or to a category of Indians, a section of the Indians. It comes very easy because, and please understand, I mean, I'm also talking with the vantage point of somebody who's the post-independence generation. So there are a lot of things that we grew up believing, which then got demolished. And our dreams died rather young. So that's why, I mean, when a lot of people, when they got influenced by what happened in the 60s, the Naxalbari movement and all, it wasn't out of some vacuum. There was a context within which it took place. The point I'm trying to make is that this self and other is there in our tradition, in our culture, but addressing at the level of culture itself will not suffice, because there is a deliberateness which goes into it. The policy making makes, or the ruling class politics, or the way in which the Indian establishment visualizes and perceives various issues play a far bigger role in creating this divide between self and other. It is a deliberate, I mean, this whole so-called nationalist imagination, nobody has looked at it. I mean, there is no one nationalist imagination in India. And it would be wrong to even to say that there is one. There are multiple. There are multiple visions and perspectives that are contending. And that's also one way of visualizing the Indianness as not being one repository, which draws only from one tradition or one source, but of multiple sources. So you can see it as an enriching experience, or you can see it, as many majoritarians believe, something like a chaotic experience that it would result, because it would be a mishmash, neither this nor that. That is also the fear. But majoritarianism is very much an intrinsic part of this whole project, because the nation state project, if you write, go to the Constitutional Assembly debates, for instance. It's remarkable for many things that are present there in a very early form, which makes it very clear that the majoritarian tendencies were there even at the time of the making of our constitution. So look at the way in which we dealt with the Dalit and the Anglo-Indian issue versus the Muslim issue. The question of protection or preferential treatment for those oppressed or discriminated section of the Indian society and others. The way in which the language policy evolved, the way in which the question of representation, reservation for Dalits, etc. figure. I mean, if you look at all these debates, you discover that there is a majoritarian. I mean, please remember, it was not an elected constituent assembly which was elected on universal suffrage. It was on a partial suffrage of those who were educated Indians. It was elected, and 2/3 of it was dominated by the Congress party. So they had a brute majority to push through anything that they wanted. It's a myth that Dr. Ambedkar wrote this constitution, because Dr. Ambedkar's lament was that the constitution I wanted is not this constitution that came into being. It's Sardar Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru's imprint on this constitution, much more than anybody else's. And the coterie around Sardar Patel with K.M. Munshi and many of the other right-wing thinkers. So if you read the Constituent Assembly debate, it comes out so clearly. It strikes you that on all important discussions and debates in the Constituent Assembly, there were these efforts. So they knew what they were engaged in, that they wanted to create an Indian nation state. This was the project that the Congress had set for itself. This is the project that the Indian Constitution set for itself. In bringing this about, in moving in that direction, it created a whole lot of problems for itself without realizing or realizing it. And deliberately, because why would otherwise sedition have come back? Within a year of constitution ruling it out, within 16 months, with the first amendment, sedition is back into operation in the Indian law, which the constitution removed. Because even when the debate was going on, many people expressed that it may actually be necessary for the Indian state to retain the sedition law, because it will come in handy to deal with all kind of situations. So they were very, very wary, and within 16 months of the passage of the Indian Constitution, see, the First Amendment brought back sedition into, which is ridiculous. How can a republic which is based on this whole notion of popular sovereignty have sedition? How can people become seditious? If people are the sovereigns in a republic, how do they become seditious? The government can become. One of the most remarkable, it's a wrong example I'm choosing. One of the most interesting things I find about the American Constitution is when the Arizona state filed a case condemning charging the US federal government with treason on the Immigration Act. They went to the Supreme Court. Of course, that wasn't held. But what I'm trying to say is that for us to imagine that in India, we would be ridiculed. How can you? Because we follow the British tradition. The state, the empire, that tradition still continues. We don't believe in due process. So our judiciary is not as independent or completely independent. Not that it has helped the United States. That's a separate matter. India, US Supreme Court is probably one of the most reactionary judiciary on earth. That's the one which upheld Jim Crow, didn't it? In the 20th century, we may read fantastic Supreme Court judgments which are remarkable in terms of the liberal principles, but we can't be oblivious of that reality where the same Supreme Court has also made one of the most, they passed the most reactionary judgments of all kinds. Look at the drug law where they upheld life sentence for a first time crime. It's absurd. And India is no better. Indian Supreme Court's record is abominable. I mean, we can cite PUCL case and this case and that case, but the reality is that in effect, none of this works. The police officer in Bastar, he says Supreme Court may have passed a judgment, but we are not bothered by it. How are they bothered? Supreme Court in the PUCL judgment, let me just read out a quote from that. I mean, we would think, oh, what a Supreme Court we have. What a fantastic Indian constitution and remarkable Indian judiciary, right? What did the Supreme Court say about in this PUCL versus, I just want to read out and then end because I'm sure that you must be getting bored also with all these long. The Supreme Court, this is PUCL versus Union of India 1997. It's a celebrated case in India and all the civil liberties and human rights organizations take pride in this. Look at our great Indian constitution. But look at the flip side then. Quote, is it open to the state to deprive a citizen? This is a case where from the court itself it will become clear what I'm talking about. Quote, is it open to the state to deprive a citizen of his life and liberty and yet claim an immunity on the ground that the said deprivation of life occurred while the officers of the state were exercising the sovereign power of the state? This was the question before the court. It ruled, the Supreme Court ruled that fundamental right to life guaranteed by Article 21 will be defeated by pleading the archaic defense of sovereign functions. Okay? We think Article 22 does not recognize any exception. But despite this brilliant judgment, and I mean the pros and all would attract us, and fill us with great joy and in the great judiciary. But what was the practical impact of this? Nothing. Zero. Because the same Supreme Court says that the state does not have immunity. But the Supreme Court has actually passed, they have not overturned other judgments which provided legal immunity. So what is this? Sometimes our judges find an opportunity and they decide to write a treatise. So you'll find that the operative part of the judgment, the prayer, is ineffective. It's very minor. It's like that famous Chhattisgarh judgment of the Supreme Court on the Salva Judo, SPOs. Ridiculous judgment. He went into his propounding his own theory and philosophy of life. But what was the operative part? That a 10th standard, unless the person is 10th standard pass, I mean that was only technical ground on which that was struck down. The SPOs, the special police officers appointment, was struck down by saying that because they had not passed 10th standard. So what did the state government do? Lowered the standard to 6. And they created auxiliary force. And what does the Supreme Court do? It is going to entertain a contempt petition which the petitioners have filed. When the time comes, we'll see what the Supreme Court says. So we have fantastic judgments, but the operative parts are petty. That is a problem. So to come back to your original question, Paul, and then I think you must all be tired also, that self and other is also created by the state. They create the enemy. When you send the troops, you do not just tell them, when you tell them that you are fighting, I mean, whom are they fighting in the Adivasi's heartland of central India? Maoists, right? Who are Maoists? Suddenly they are demons. They are terrorists. Now you can't equate them with Pakistan and Muslims. So you have to employ other...
Isn't that clip of the brigadier in Red and Dream?
Yes.
That's the...
See? And did you see how the soldiers are trained and how the dogs are trained? And see the similarity between the two? Did you notice that? I mean, one of the brilliant part of that documentary, in the documentary, there's that scene where they show these dogs being trained, and you also see that soldiers being trained. And there is this interview with Brigadier Panwa. He's very proud of his boys.
This is Sanjay Kak's
Sanjay Kak's that.
Okay.
Red and Dream.
Yeah. They create enemy and the other. So it's not just a cultural thing that, Kashmiri Muslims, even Kashmiri Muslims who are fighting for the right of self-determination, they're fighting Indian occupation. It's a very clearly politically articulated position. It's not an Indian cultural entity they are fighting or Indian civilization. They are fighting Indian occupation by an Indian state. It's a very political concept. Whereas Indian intelligentsia says we are fighting Muslim fundamentalism in Kashmir, which is backed by Pakistan. Cultural argument is being advanced by, and that is what we do. I mean, when Muslims, this whole argument against war against terror also is, a large part of it is based on culturalist explanation, and that it's intrinsic to Islam. One section, the right wing says, the hardliner says that it's intrinsic in Islam, that it's anti-democratic, and therefore it would not, it is reactionary, and therefore you have to fight it and crush it. The reformist Muslims say, well, Islam is not bad, it's only bad Muslims who are practicing bad Islam. So they're trapped in the same continuum. It's not. State creates this. That is what I believe. I believe that this otherness and the difference between self and otherness is something which is deliberately promoted as part of a deliberate part of government policies. Therefore, Indians versus Kashmiris, and therefore Indian tourists behave in a particular way in Kashmir. And it's remarkable to go and watch and observe this, to realize what I'm saying. Khwaja Ahmad Abbas wrote way back in 1959, can you imagine, that the Indian tourists behave like Indian soldiers in Kashmir. A very powerful statement. Think over it, ponder over it, and it tells you a lot. Thank you very much. I'm sure I must have tired you.